Hello, this is King Rex coming at you with another reaction video. This is a reaction to Mr. Beats' Why the Electoral College is Terrible. The first part, he says why he doesn't like it. It just says that he doesn't like it. Then he explains what it is a little bit. He really doesn't get to the meat of the video until you get to here, a little over 3 minutes in, and he starts talking about faithless electors, so we'll pick up right here.
Who the majority of their state voted for and vote with them, but still, they could vote for whoever they want. When this happens, they are called faithless electors, meaning they cast their vote for someone other than who the majority of their state voted for. This has happened 167 times.
Well, first off, the reason why they did this system was that they wanted to have an extra insulation against electing a really bad candidate. That's why they allowed for faithless electors. Like, if for some reason someone that was totally unfit was elected, the Electoral College could go against that. Also, of the 167 times there were faithless electors, most of them were in cases of, like a majority, were in cases where the candidate who won those electoral votes died between the election and when the Electoral College met. In fact, I believe Horatio Seymour died before. It was either him or Horace Gray. Whoever, one of the two against Ulysses Grant actually died before the Electoral College met. So all the people that voted, all the electoral votes he had were given to other candidates. Some of those people voted for his vice president for president and then chose to vote for someone else for vice president as well. And this 167 includes all votes for president and for vice president. Also, William Howard Taft's vice president died between the election of 1912 and when the Electoral College met. So once again, you had votes that were cast for someone else because the guy had died. There also are a few cases like where if someone knew their candidate lost, they might have voted for someone else. For example, one elector voted for Reagan in the 1976 election rather than Gerald Ford. In 1820, one elector voted for John Quincy Adams because they felt that George Washington was the only candidate that should win unanimously in the Electoral College, so they just voted for someone else, just so he wouldn't have that honor. And there's been a few here and there, but there really hasn't been a lot of times where it's actually happened. And it never actually affected the election. I mean, it's never made a difference, a faithless elector. But this is basically these electors don't even have to vote the way they need to, which is true, but that was really put in as an insulation against if someone that was really, really terrible got in that shouldn't be president. And I know some people might make arguments saying, well, they don't like certain people that have gotten in, but that's what the electors are there for, it's basically just insulating against a really terrible person winning the presidency.
In American history, and 10 times in the 2016 election.
The reason why it happened 10 times in the 2016 election was because Hillary Clinton actually asked people within the Electoral College to vote against. In a last-ditch effort for her to win the presidency, she asked the electors to vote for anyone but Trump to throw it into the House of Representatives, hoping that she could then win. They said you could vote for anyone. And in fact, if you look at most of the ones that voted that way, in order to try to entice Republican electors to vote the other way, they actually was mostly Democrat ones. You can see 4 here in the state of Washington and 1 in Hawaii, versus just 2 in Texas that voted the opposite way. So really, it doesn't add up to 10, but I think there's a few where you're not allowed. So those ones were put back, because I think one person in Minnesota was made to vote in Minnesota for Hillary Clinton, even though they voted for someone else. So that was basically, they were trying to get the electors to vote against the way the voters wanted them to vote. Hillary Clinton enticed them to do that. So you don't have to vote for me, but you can vote for anyone but Trump, because she didn't want Trump to win, because she wanted to win. It's her last-ditch effort of winning, hoping that she could get it in the House.
in the 2016 election. In these states, you can get punished, usually it's just a fine, for being a faithless elector. However, it's rarely been enforced, and there are no laws whatsoever forcing electors to vote for who they were supposed to vote for in the other states. Whichever presidential candidate gets the majority of electoral votes wins. So the magic number is 270 out of the 538. In each state, it's winner takes all. The candidate who wins the electoral votes only has to win the plurality of the votes, not the majority. So the most votes, even if it's far from 50%. So
the reason why is because you can't guarantee 50% unless you limit the number of choices. If you let any more than two people run, less than 50% can win. In fact, it's happened before. Most of the states in 1992, because Perot pulled such a large percentage as third-party candidate, the only state that had a clear majority was Arkansas.
So hypothetically, let's say there are 10 candidates on the ballot running for president.
Because of the Electoral College, there won't be 10 viable candidates on the ballot ever. In fact, if you got rid of the Electoral College, this is something that could happen. So what he's basically explaining here, I've seen the video, this part of it, is he's trying to say this could happen with the Electoral College, but the Electoral College bars this from happening.
And their support is fairly evenly distributed. The winning candidate could squeak by with 11% of the popular vote and win the state.
The thing is, this won't happen because in the election of 1824, there were 4 viable candidates, which threw the election into the House. So in order to stop the elections from being thrown into the House, parties are formed that make political coalitions, and there's 2 big parties, the Republican and Democrat party. So you could have 10 people on the ballot, but most of those people generally won't pull hardly any votes. There is a few times in history where there was a pretty big third party, but in this situation, let's say there were 10 people on the ballot, there was no electoral college, and let's say it was 1968 when George Wallace pulled 13.5% of the vote. He could have became president without the Electoral College, but because it existed, you had one big Republican Party rather than 5 parties and one big Democrat Party instead of 5 smaller parties. So it barred an extremist candidate from winning the presidency. That's one of the things the Electoral College does. It doesn't allow this situation to happen.
This is in California, which has nearly 40 million people. That's 4.4 million people getting representation and 35.6 million people not.
That's not how representation works. You're represented by whoever wins the district you're in. So even if you vote against someone, they're still your representative. You just may disagree with them and have liked or preferred the other guy. You're still represented by them.
Maine and Nebraska have what's known as the congressional district method, which is a proportional representation for the electoral votes. Each district has one elector who votes on behalf of their district. That's why in 2016, Maine's map looked like this. So already, just by giving you the definition of the Electoral College, I'm hoping you already realize how terrible it is, but in case you haven't, let me elaborate.
Actually, he hasn't shown how it's terrible because what he's shown is actually a good thing about the Electoral College, and everything else he did was just normally explaining how it works, so which everyone should already know. That's why I skipped that portion of the video.
First of all, it's really undemocratic.
But we live in a republic, not a democracy.
Let's roll the first clip.
Every 4 years, we hear the words Electoral College over and over again, but we never talk about what a ridiculous and, frankly, undemocratic system it really is.
Oh, okay, undemocratic. This is the crux of the argument against the Electoral College, right? It's undemocratic. Yes. People like they fooled. No, that's by design. The United States has never been a democracy.
The United States has never been a democracy. He's so bold with that statement, but I cringe every time I hear it. It's so utterly wrong.
Actually, it's Mr. Beat that's utterly wrong, because a democracy's form of government would mean that everyone votes on every issue, and you would have no Congress. Basically, an issue would be put forth to the people, and everyone would vote on it, like For example, when we went to war in Iraq, every single person in the country would have got a vote as to whether or not we got to go to war in Iraq. It wouldn't have been Congress, it would have been all the people in the country that are eligible to vote. The same way with Obamacare. It wouldn't have been enacted by Congress, it would have been voted on by all the people in the country that are eligible voters. Basically, Mr. Beat doesn't understand when they say we live in a republic, not a democracy, um, which is what makes me cringe that he doesn't know this when he's a teacher. He has said in one video that he taught economics, but he doesn't represent himself as a history teacher in most of his videos. So if he didn't know the difference between a republic and a democracy, he shouldn't be teaching history or government classes at all.
Yes, we have democracy. It's called voting.
This is the confusion part here. It is true that we vote for our leaders, but when we elect leaders, we're electing representatives, which is why it's a republic. If voting for your leaders is the different thing than voting directly on the laws. Democracy votes directly on the laws. A republic, you vote for people to enact the laws.
Americans do it every 2 years. Okay, if you claim that we don't have democracy, then why bother even having elections? What is the point?
We live in a republic.
Yeah, but can you even define what a republic is?
This is another part that I really dislike about his video. What he's doing here with the goofy puppet with the funny voice is he's trying to make it sound like anybody who doesn't agree with him that the Electoral College is bad is kind of a moron or idiot. The fact is he defines a republic in this video, but he doesn't define what a democracy is. If you defined what a democracy was as a form of government, it would have shown that the puppet is correct and that he is incorrect. Just because you get to vote for your leaders doesn't mean it's not a republic. It should also be noted I've never seen it done where the only defense of keeping the Electoral College is we live in a republic. I've never seen that once in my lifetime. It's usually people trying to get rid of the Electoral College that the only thing they can say is it's undemocratic. We live in a democracy when we don't live in a democracy, and it still is. It's more democratic than the way most leaders in the world are elected, because even in countries like, say, Canada, Great Britain have parliament. People elect leaders to parliament, and then the leaders in parliament elect the prime minister, who's basically like the president. So if we had that form of government, we wouldn't elect a president at all. We just elect Congress, and then Congress would pick a president.
Oh no, you're not pulling out the dreaded dictionary again, are you?
Why, yes, I am. A republic is a type of government in which supreme power resides in a body of citizens entitled to vote and is exercised by representatives responsible to them and governing according to law. In other words, a government run by representatives who have to follow the law. How do these representatives get into office? Citizens vote for them.
But this is his misunderstanding. He should have flipped his dictionary to see what a democracy was as a form of government. He's confusing the two. Hopefully, he's just doing it on accident. If he's doing it on purpose, it makes him dishonest. But there's a difference between a democracy and a republic that he just does not understand.
It's indirect democracy, sure, but it's still freaking democracy.
But the form of government isn't what's called a democracy. The form of government is called a republic. A democracy is where you don't have any representatives. You vote on all the issues yourself.
Founding fathers hated democracy.
I've never heard anyone say the founding fathers hated democracy. They wanted some safeguards to protect the majority and the minority of people.
Well, of course the Founding Fathers were not a fan of democracy. I mean, several Founding Fathers also thought slavery was okay.
Most of the Founding Fathers were against slavery, but the thing is that if you look through all of world history, slavery existed everywhere when the Constitution was written. The first country to abolish slavery was Haiti, when it was formed via a slave revolt in like 1804. Slavery was the norm. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not making excuses for it, but it was the norm. And most of the founding fathers wanted to abolish slavery in the United States, but they wanted all the colonies to form one big government, and South Carolina and Georgia would not if slavery was outright abolished.
And they thought that only white property-owning males should be the ones to...
Um, this is also, it's not put in the Constitution that only property-owning white males should be able to vote, and voting was extended to non-landowners by the founding fathers. It was done when Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe were president, but it was done on a state-by-state basis because the founding fathers allowed the states to decide who could vote. They let the states write their own voting laws.
vote. As much of a fan as I am of Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, they were not perfect. And yeah, the United States didn't become that democratic until years later, when Andrew Jackson became the first president of the, quote, common man in 1828. A big reason why was because men didn't have to own property anymore to vote. The 15th Amendment, passed not until 1870, said that men could vote no matter what their skin color is, and regardless if they used to be a slave or not. The 17th Amendment gave people the right to vote for senators. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, finally gave women the right to vote. After whites kept finding ways to suppress the black vote throughout the South, the 24th Amendment ended taxes having to be paid to vote in 1964. The next year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act to further protections for voting rights. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18.
All these were cases that states, when the Constitution was written, could decide who voted and why. Basically, it was all up to the states. So what basically happened was some states were doing bad things, so they passed amendments to change that who was allowed to vote. They didn't allow former slaves to vote, so they passed an amendment that they couldn't bar former slaves from voting. They wouldn't allow women to vote, so they passed a law that would allow women to vote. Things like that. These were basically just corrections they made after the fact, because they wanted basically to fix loopholes that states were using to deny rights to their citizens. But the Electoral College doesn't deny rights to the citizens at all. There's nothing in the Electoral College that is not allowing certain people to vote.
So throughout American history, the laws that were stupid have been changed. And we can change the laws that are stupid now through new amendments.
But the Electoral College isn't stupid. It's only stupid if you don't understand how the actual form of government that we have and how it works.
Remember that a little later. The Electoral College also gives more power to states with less people in them.
If you look at this graphic, you would think that there's more electoral votes from Kansas than there are from California. That is simply untrue. It doesn't work that way. It does give a little extra voice to smaller states, but the big states still have way more voice. California has more electoral votes than all the states with just 3 electoral votes, and I think even if you add in the ones with 4 electoral votes. So California doesn't have less power in picking the president than Kansas does.
Well, duh. Of course it does. The founders wanted it that way.
I don't care if they did. It's wrong.
Actually, the reason why they give a little more voice in who the president is to smaller states is because they wanted every state and region to have a voice in who the president was. They also wanted a president who had broad support throughout the country. You can't do this if a president can win 3 or 4 states and not appeal to anyone else.
If your state has less people, you have more power.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Not really, because even if you look at it, California has way more power than, say, Wyoming or Kansas or any other state in the union, because they have the most representatives in Congress and they still have the most people in the Electoral College.
Crowder is okay with one person's vote being worth more than another person's vote. But everyone's vote should count equally. I am not better than you, and my vote should not be worth more than yours. But currently, if you live in Texas, like Steven Crowder does, then my vote is worth more than yours because I live in Kansas. Kansas has 6 electoral votes, or 1 for every 500,000 people. Texas has 38 electoral votes, or 1 for every 763,000 people.
What that doesn't take into account is that not everyone votes, and not everyone's eligible to vote. And states with bigger populations tend to have a higher percentage of their population that are ineligible to vote because states like California, Texas, Florida, and New York not only have more people in them that are not citizens, they also have more people that are felons as a percentage of their population. For example, if you go down here, I actually have the numbers right here. It says Texas, your Texas and Kansas math leaves out one very important point: the number of people who actually vote. In 2016, so the number of people who voted for vote in Texas was 8.9 million, whereas 249,000 per electoral vote, or 264,000 votes per representative. Kansas had almost 2 million people, which is 199 per electoral vote. So yes, they get more power per electoral vote because there's less people per electoral vote, but there's more people per representative because it's 298. So basically, Texas has extra representation in the House of Representatives all the time in every single election, which does make a difference because the extra representative, whereas Kansas gets a little bit more saying who's president, but it's never really made that much of a difference. There's only been 4 elections throughout the over 230 years where the person who won the popular vote did not win the electoral vote. In 2 of those elections, there was rampant cheating in the South in 1876 and in 1888, where the South had a fair vote where they weren't barring blacks from voting. The candidate that won the electoral vote would have also won the popular vote.
Or as CGP Grey puts it in his classic video, Destroying the Electoral College,
one Vermonter's vote, according to the Electoral College, is worth 3 Texans' votes, and one Wyomingite's vote is worth 4 Californians.
But
like I said, what he's not looking at is the actual number of people that vote, just the number of people that live within that state. And everyone's eligible to vote. But he's also taking the most extreme examples that he can take. Both sides have small states. Delaware, Hawaii, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont. These states all vote Democrat as compared to states like Wyoming, Alaska, Montana. These states all vote Republican. It balances out kind of.
without the Electoral College, candidates would just ignore the smaller states.
they are
This actually is true. They would ignore the smaller states. No one would care about votes within these smaller states.
already do.
Actually, that's completely false. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump actually campaigned in Maine and even Trump when he was against Biden, which is a small state, because they wanted that electoral vote. They don't ignore smaller states due to the Electoral College. They would completely ignore small states, and the issues to people in smaller states would not matter because all you'd want to do is harvest votes from big cities where you get a lot of bang for the buck. So the issues that were important to people who lived in the cities would be put ahead of the issues that people lived outside of the cities.
Well, but we're a republic.
Once again, with that dumb mantra.
Now, there's a common argument that candidates would only campaign in big cities.
People would be campaigning in the big. Republicans would go to Tarrant County, Texas, Fort Worth, and the suburbs of Houston and Orange County, California. Democrats would go to San Francisco and New York, and a big part of the country would be overlooked.
The big reason for this is because you can't just have people pandering to a few big cities. Let's stop by New York, D.C., Los Angeles, San Francisco, Detroit in the 50s, promise them a bunch of stuff, wrap this up, and go home.
So let's add all the places they mentioned up.
Well, there would be more than just those few cities. And once again, this is him trying to make it sound that way. I mean, it wouldn't just be these 5 cities on the bottom or the 7 or 8 that he's got on there. There would be other big cities. They wouldn't completely ignore, say, Miami or Philadelphia or Chicago. Chicago's still, I believe, the 3rd biggest city in the country. Philadelphia is still in the top 10. Obviously, those cities would be included too. They're giving examples here. And what he's doing is he's ignoring other big cities, but you notice that there would be nowhere in the middle of the country.
just to be generous. That totals 25.8 million people. The U.S. has 326 million people. Why would candidates only focus on 1/13 of the country?
Because there would be more than just that list of big cities. You'd have Miami, you would have Philadelphia. New York City also has big suburbs. Boston, it wouldn't be too hard to hit. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., jump down to Miami, maybe hit New Orleans, a few big cities in Texas, go up to California coast. Maybe hit some of the big cities along the Great Lakes like Buffalo, Cleveland, Detroit, Illinois, Chicago, Milwaukee. It wouldn't be just these 8 cities, but it would be just cities altogether. You'd go to Atlanta, you would ignore the rest of Georgia. You'd go to, say, maybe Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, and ignore the rest of Ohio. You'd go to Chicago or ignore the rest of Illinois, which is kind of what happens anyway. Chicago's completely dominated by Illinois, so the people living in the rest of Illinois have really no voice who the president is anyway, because the people in Chicago dominate the whole rest of the state. Same way with New York City.
And besides, under the Electoral College, they only focus on swing states, or
The thing with swing states is they change. It's not always Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida. There's times that every state in the union at one point or another has been a swing state, with maybe the exception of Hawaii, but Hawaii has voted Republican on multiple occasions. No, it generally goes Democrat. In fact, if you look at the early part, it was, I think, pretty back and forth. The thing is, swing states change. Plus, the reason why swing states are swing states is because these states basically represent the whole country on a smaller level. They represent both the left and the right end of the political spectrum in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Florida, and several other swing states. And states that weren't swing states will become swing states, and states that were swing states will no longer be swing states. For a long time, New York was a swing state. It's nowhere near a swing state now. So is California. For a long time, Georgia was never a swing state, but it was a major swing state in the election of 2020. Swing states change. And it's not like the issues in Ohio are only issues that matter to the people in the state of Ohio and don't matter to anyone else in the country.
or states that are too close to predict who will win there based on polls. Sure, swing states can change, but Americans who don't live in a swing state often feel their voice is not heard.
Wyoming, they can't have their vote drowned out by people who are corralled in the big cities.
Wyoming can't have their vote drowned out by people who are corralled into the big cities? First,
notice how he tries to make Crowder look crazy. He only takes a clip here and a clip there.
First of all, people are not corralled into the big cities.
He's also trying to use the manage. What Crowder meant is that there's people that live in the big cities, and some of the people that do live in those cities really can't get out of them. Some of the poor people don't have a choice.
Choose to live there for various reasons. Second, votes are not, quote, drowned out. Votes
Actually, they would be. If you got rid of the Electoral College, it would not matter who people wanted that lived in the states, in the Dakotas, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah. None of those states would matter. They would all be drowned out because they're all small little states with not many votes in a big area. No one would care about what happens there. You can also throw Kansas and Nebraska in that list as well. Probably even Oklahoma. I mean, it would be literally in the middle of the country. West of the Mississippi would be Texas and the states that touch the Pacific Ocean, and probably Arizona because Phoenix is a pretty big city. East of the Mississippi, the states that go down on the Mississippi would have big cities on them, and around the Great Lakes and on the East Coast. Really, it'd be you live by the water in a big city, your vote matters. If you don't, oh well, it doesn't. Because what would happen is over time, because candidates want to win voters in the cities where they can get a big impact, they would change what they actually run on. There wouldn't be a candidate for people that live in the suburbs and in the country. It'd be, if you live in the city, we want your vote.
are counted the same in Wyoming as they are in Los Angeles.
Here's the thing though. He's actually going against his other thing. He said votes are counted the same in Wyoming as they are in Los Angeles, but then earlier he said they were worth more in Wyoming. If they can't be drowned out one way, they can't be drowned out the other way either. Then
There's just a lot more votes in Los Angeles. Say candidates only focus their campaigns to the top 100 most populated metro areas in the country. Well, those cities all have media companies that broadcast to the surrounding rural areas.
Yes, but the issues to people living in those rural areas wouldn't matter as much to people living in those cities. They would know where the votes are at. They wouldn't care if they won a few rural counties like this here. Compare this picture to the picture we had all the people standing on the city, or the picture he had was probably from New York or Los Angeles, compared to this middle of the country's one. Where are you going to go to get the votes? This guy's farmhouse or a city street where there's thousands of people?
They would not be ignored. The Electoral College makes it so candidates who represent the minority often get elected. As CGP Gray.
It's actually funny because Bill Clinton won. This CGP Gray guy, I mean, he is in love with that guy, I guess. Maybe they have a good friendship, but the reason for the Electoral College is it wants to have a majority. If a president has a majority in the Electoral College, it lends, it makes them look like they have credence, it lends credence to that guy, you know. Whereas if they don't, if you had some guy that won 20% of the total votes, it's different than if you have a guy who won over 50% of the Electoral College.
Gray pointed out, a candidate who gets just 22% of the popular vote can be elected president in the Electoral College system.
The problem with that is that what he actually is doing is he's saying that if they won just a bare majority in the states, enough states that he can win a majority in the Electoral College, he would win the popular vote. But this would never happen. You're not going to have a candidate that just wins by like one vote in New York State, one vote in California, one vote in Texas, one vote in Florida, doesn't get any votes whatsoever in the Dakotas, Montana, Utah, and all these other small states. That's how they come up with that math. It's math that would never happen, ever. You're not going to win every single. You're not going to win by one vote in the state of New York, one vote in the state of Illinois, and not win any votes in say the smaller states that touch them, like say Vermont. You won't win any votes, but you win by one vote in the state of New York. You think that's going to happen? You think you're going to win by one vote in Illinois, but not win a single vote in Iowa? That's the math for that.
But without the Electoral College, you'd still have candidates who don't get a majority of the popular vote, but get elected president.
Hey, you actually made a good point there.
Hey, thanks.
We've had 14 presidents who've been elected with a plurality of the vote. That is to say, they didn't get 50%. If we were to go to popular vote only, how long would it be that before we'd have runoffs? I mean, Bill Clinton was elected twice, never got 50%.
Runoffs would be a bad thing because what a runoff is what you do is you go out, have an election, and then a month later, you have the election again. Well, a lot of people are going to want to go out a month later and vote again, especially on a national runoff level. The other thing is that we have primaries, which are there to eliminate different people. So we actually do kind of have a two-tiered system. You have your primaries, which pick the candidates for the parties. Then you have the general election, which are among the best candidates from those parties. Why would you want to add a third election, which would be probably in December when the weather's really getting bad, to have another time where people have to go out and vote again? Runoffs really aren't that good.
Of the vote. Woodrow Wilson elected twice, never got 50% of the vote. Abraham Lincoln got elected with 40-some-odd% of the vote.
Right. However, ranked choice voting would solve that problem.
Actually, ranked choice voting is really bad because what it does is you vote for who you think the best candidate is, and let's say he's got 7 here. If your candidate finishes 7th, your vote doesn't count anymore. They give it to someone else who you thought was the second best candidate. So you're ranked, and if that second best candidate gets eliminated, then it goes to your third, your fourth, it might go all the way down to your 6th favorite candidate. Ranked choice voting actually disenfranchises people because the person you vote for, if they're not one of the top 2, your vote don't count at all.
Also called alternative choice voting, CGP Grey has a great video explaining that, which I will link here. Oh, and Abraham Lincoln turned out to be a great president. So
exactly. Abraham Lincoln was a great president, but without the Electoral College, he would have never been elected. If it would have been ranked choice voting, you think the people that voted for Breckinridge, Bell, and Douglas, any of them would have picked Lincoln as their second choice? No, one of the other ones. It would have come down to one of the other three candidates because he got the least votes. Bell would have been eliminated, and his votes would have probably mostly went to Douglas, but someone went to Breckinridge because he wanted pro-slavery states that actually had slaves, so they weren't going to go to Lincoln. They would have went to one of those other two candidates, and then whichever one of those had the least popular votes, they would have been eliminated, and they would have beat Lincoln. So without the Electoral College, you do not get Abraham Lincoln.
So I think you're hurting your argument there, bud.
It's funny because he's hurting his argument because if we did it the way he wants to do it, there's no Lincoln. You either have Stephen Douglas, who died shortly after Lincoln took office and had a former governor of Georgia, who joined the Confederacy, or John Breckinridge, who actually joined the Confederacy. That's who the president would have been with ranked choice voting or runoff elections or whatever else he wanted to have.
And some Electoral College supporters say that it protects our two-party system. Without the Electoral College, we'd have too many choices for president?
Actually, we have those choices. We just have them beforehand. Basically, what it does is that you have two parties that form, and they basically make a party that forms on several political issues. If you didn't have the two-party system, you'd be like each major issue would have one person. So you might vote for a person because that issue is the most important to you, but they might not agree with you on other issues. This way, at least you get to see where each candidate is across the entire spectrum of issues, so you can make a more informed choice. Without the Electoral College, you may, let's say, your biggest issue is whether you're for or against abortion. Either way. So you vote for a candidate that you agree with on that issue. Well, you may agree with them on that issue, but you may be against them on every other issue. You may be against them on whether you want socialized health care or not. You may be against them whether on gun rights or not. You may be against them on free trade or not. With the two-party system, you know where the candidate comes down on all the issues, not just one issue.
Too many choices for president? That sounds horrifying. I hate choices. I'd rather just have two crappy candidates.
But people can't handle more than two candidates. They'd have to research the candidates.
People don't say that, but let's be honest, a lot of people don't research the candidates. I don't think people would research 10 different candidates. It would literally say, well, the most important issue to me is X, so that's what I'm voting. It's kind of how it works in Canada, and you can have really horrible leaders that way.
Sounds good to me. When people buy a new car, they do their research before. It's not like you just go to the dealership and say, I only want two choices, either a Geo Metro or a Chrysler PT Cruiser.
But when people buy a new car, they know they can look at a lot of different things on a car. It's not like they say, well, here's the car that gets the best fuel mileage. Here's the car with the best 0 to 60 time. Here's the car with the best towing. And here's the car with the most room in it. Pick one. And you don't know anything else about the car. You would actually have parties form around one issue. There'd be two parties, one that's pro-abortion, one that's pro-life. There'd be two parties, one that's for expanding gun rights, one that's for limiting gun rights. There'd be two parties, one that's pro-free trade and one that's against free trade. That's how it would work. The parties would be very narrow because the major parties right now would just split her apart.
Right now, Americans often don't feel like they have a voice due to the Electoral College. The Electoral College actually is responsible for lower voter turnout.
I'd like to see his research that it causes lower voter turnout. I could see people getting more frustrated when there's 10 presidents not knowing who to vote for than being able to see like two choices, especially when you consider that there's generally 3 debates every year between those two choices.
In states that lean either solidly Democratic Party or solidly Republican Party. It seems that I've already changed Crowder's mind.
It's a representative republic. We should have terms. We should be changing these politicians regularly.
Exactly. It's called voting. It's called democracy.
Actually, once again, he misunderstands what Crowder is saying. When he's saying term limits is not democracy. Term limits just means a person can't run more than once. He's not saying people shouldn't be voted on at all. He's misunderstanding that voting equals having a democratic form of government.
Let's get out that dictionary again and look up the definition of democracy. A system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state, typically through elected representatives.
That's actually not what a democracy as a form of government is. That's basically people being allowed to, that's a bad definition in the dictionary.
Elected. Other arguments fans of the Electoral College often bring up: that's how the Founding Fathers designed it. They feared a democracy and wanted a safeguard.
No, the Founding Fathers designed the Constitution to have checks and balances within it. They didn't fear democracy, they just feared mob rule, so they put in the Electoral College as one way of a check and balance against mob rule.
Well, actually, no. Several of the founders wanted direct elections.
But overall, enough of them wanted a different way. And there is direct elections of a lot of people, but just not everyone within the government.
The Electoral College was a compromise to make those folks happy. And again, if they did design it that way, much of the other stuff they designed has since been changed. It forces a presidential candidate to have appeal across different regions.
Which is a good thing, because if you went to a system that he wants, you could have 10 candidates that are regional or only appeal to people living in the cities or stuff like that.
This Slate article says, quote, no region, south, northeast, etc., has enough electoral votes to elect a president.
Exactly, which if you went to a popular vote, you'd have more candidates, which means one region all by itself could have the most people vote for their candidate, and therefore they would be able to elect it. Like I said, the South could have elected a single individual candidate if there was no electoral college. Lincoln would have never won.
Unquote. I'm assuming this is based on the fear of a candidate like Abraham Lincoln getting 40% and still winning, completely neglecting the South.
But the thing is that the country wasn't just two regions when Lincoln was president. You had the New England states, which Lincoln won all of, the Mid-Atlantic states, which Lincoln won New York, Pennsylvania. There was a split in New Jersey, but he lost Maryland and Delaware. You had the Midwestern states, which he won all of those states, which was Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. He also won Minnesota. I'm pretty sure Minnesota was a state at that time. He lost the Deep South, which were the first states to secede, and he lost the Upper South, which most of those states seceded, some stayed in the Union. But he also won the Far West. Lincoln won all the Far West states, all the Midwest states, all the near West states that were not Midwestern states, but west of the Mississippi, but that did not have slavery, which was at that time just Minnesota and Iowa. He won all the New England states, and he split the Mid-Atlantic states. So Lincoln did well in several areas of the country, he just didn't win in the Deep South or the Upper South. That's where he lost. So he wasn't just a one-region candidate, but you could have a situation where if 10 people run, you have a one-region candidate like, say, George Wallace, who only won Deep South states, but won 13.5% of the vote. He would have won enough votes in a 10 candidate election to get a majority if they all ran relatively close together.
Again, ranked choice voting helps solve this issue.
Except ranked choice voting removes your choice. If your guy if there's 5 choices, you pick the number 5 guy, he gets eliminated, so your vote doesn't count anymore.
That Slate article also argued, quote, a large state gets more attention from presidential candidates in a campaign than a small state does.
If I understand where he's going. He's going to say, well, California and New York don't, because California and New York are so, and Texas, basically, they're so extreme on the sides. But if, like, say, Ohio and Florida are, if those two states are swing states that can be won by either candidate, and let's say also New Hampshire, what states are you going to put more emphasis in? Ohio, Florida, or New Hampshire? Which one do you want to put your emphasis in to win if they're all swing states?
Unquote. But that argument is weak because large states would get more attention without the Electoral College as well.
But small states still get some attention.
Founding fathers could not have foreseen the changes their country would go through in 250 years. The country has become more nationalized culturally. The internet and other mass communications has united the country in unforeseeable ways. The divide today remains mostly rural versus urban, but today less than 15% of Americans live in rural areas.
But it's not just rural versus urban. It's not just country versus city. You have the suburbs too, which go more toward the rural than the urban areas as far as issues matter. So that number is going to change a lot if you actually look at the in between.
No offense to those living in rural areas, but should you have that much leverage over everyone else?
Plus, if a candidate only actually appealed to that 15% of the population, there's no way they would win. It wouldn't matter. Even if they won all the little small states that are mostly rural states like Wyoming, New Hampshire, I don't think New Hampshire's even, but let's say Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, they would still lose, and they would lose in a landslide because you have to win at least some big states to be competitive. You can't win the presidency without winning at least something out of the mid-Atlantic states or the Midwestern states. You're just not going to do it, especially if you eliminate California, Texas, and Florida from that equation as well.
Now, what's one of the real reasons why the Electoral College exists? Well, the founders knew that if the popular vote elected the president, the Northerners would dominate elections, and therefore the institution of slavery would be threatened.
This is actually false. You'll remember earlier in the video where it says that they only allowed white landowners to vote. Well, white landowners were not the majority of people in the North at the time. You had a lot of people within the North that were poor and didn't own land. Those people couldn't vote, but they counted as whole people as far as representation goes. Whereas people that were slaves in the South only counted as 3/5. So actually, the 3/5 compromise gave more power to the North until what was termed as popular sovereignty, where you didn't have to own land, came in about. Then it gave a little more power to the South. So it wasn't put in for to make slavery more powerful. Plus, there was only, I think Massachusetts was the only state in which slavery was completely banned in the North. And I think Pennsylvania had already started its eventual emancipation, which there was slavery in Pennsylvania almost up to the Civil War, even with eventual emancipation.
Why do Americans either really defend or really hate the Electoral College? There's no way to know for sure, but there is one giant clue. Look at the political leanings of those who support it. They tend to be folks who like Republicans. The ones who usually hate it, those who tend to like Democrats.
Which we know where he lands in that list.
Ain't no George W. Bush supporter in 2000 saying he hates the Electoral College. And there ain't no Al Gore supporter in 2000 saying he loves it. The same goes with 2016. The most vocal supporters of the Electoral College were Trump supporters, and the most vocal opponents were Clinton supporters. But here's another example of how the minority actually...
So, if it's basically people only want to change it to make their side more politically powerful, that would be a terrible reason to change the system. We want more power, so we want you to get rid of this thing that's kind of hurting us, having more power.
Has the power in the country. Poll after poll reveals that only 30% are okay with the Electoral College.
I think if they understood how it worked completely, they wouldn't be, though. And just because the majority doesn't like something doesn't mean it's right. Remember, as he stated, at one point in time, the majority of the people in the country thought that slavery was okay. Nazis were the majority in Germany for quite a while. So just because the majority supports something doesn't mean it's good. That's why you have checks and balances against mob rule.
70% are against it, and they've been against it for decades.
If that many people were actually against Electoral College, it would have been gotten rid of by now. It could be the way they ask the questions, too, because I've seen they can ask questions in such a manner as to elicit a certain response.
1% were against it in 1968. Oh, and Andrew Jackson was strongly against it. President Trump is against it. Well, he used to be. Why must the minority keep the status quo that the majority hates?
Minority? Better than a majority? What about mob rule?
Well, the minority can be just as corrupt as the mob.
But the minority doesn't control everything, though. No matter what, the majority gets the House of Representatives. Only 4 times in 230 years has a candidate who won the most popular votes not won in the Electoral College. So realistically, the minorities controlling everything is actually false.
Anyway, more than 700 proposals have been introduced in Congress to either reform or get rid of the Electoral College. There have been more proposals for constitutional amendments on changing it than any other subject. A big reason why I am making this video now is because we are just about as far away from a presidential election here in the States as we can get. This should not be a partisan issue. This is a common sense issue. The Electoral College is horrible.
You would say that, you Democrat.
What did you call me? You take that back, man. That was really low.
So, this is the thing here. He's trying to make it sound like, well, if you oppose me, you're just a partisan. You can't oppose me unless you're biased. Plus, he makes the whole goofy puppet thing.
Well, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings.
Well, I forgive you. Thanks for listening to my argument, by the way.
What? Oh, I wasn't really listening. Have I ever told you that we live in a republic?
Anyway, remember how at the beginning of the video I told you that Kansas has around 3 million people? Well, in the last presidential election, the candidate who won the election had 3 million less votes than the candidate who won the popular vote. Let's introduce democracy to the United States.
Well, he's saying let's introduce democracy in the United States, which means he thinks it doesn't exist here. But that entire difference in vote came in, I think, like New York City or maybe LA. Like I said, it's only happened like 4 times where the person winning the most popular votes didn't win the election.
Let's end minority rule. Let's fix the horrible Electoral College.
I'm going to stop here because I just think it's pointless to go any further. There's probably maybe I'll go through that a little bit, but if we don't have minority rule because 4 times in 230 years, twice which were done by massive cheating, that the person did not win that won the most popular votes. Like I said, you have to have broad ability of precedent. That's something the candidates lacked that didn't win when they won the popular vote. They're only popular in small parts of the country.
So what do you think? I did leave some arguments out for the sake of time, but feel free to add arguments on both sides in the comments below.
He really only made one argument at all. We're a democracy, which we do have the right to vote, but as a form of government, we're not a democracy. The form of government of a democracy, a true democracy, is you vote on every issue, not you elect representatives. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and have a great day.